Russia only understands one thing, which is strength. And that means that it comes right back to where we started about delaying spending what needs to be spent on defense for 10 years. That will be construed as weakness by Putin, and he will absolutely double down on the production of Orezhnik missiles and building up other capabilities. Whereas if he is met by strength, he will back off.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're talking to the former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Sir Richard Shirreff. General Shirreff spent 37 years in the British Army and has commanded troops on operations at every level. He co-founded the global risk advisory company Strategia Worldwide and is the author of War with Russia. General Shirreff, great to see you again. Welcome back to Frontline.
Very good to see you as well, Kate. Thank you for having me.
So, Richard, the NATO summit this week was declared historic. The moment the alliance went back to its roots, functioning as a collective defence system to deter Russia, or so said the Finnish president. What was your takeaway? Did this strike you as a strong, unified alliance?
No, I think it was pretty underwhelming, if I'm honest. I can see why politically they had to say that. Because the entire political European leadership of NATO is terrified that Trump is going to walk away. But the reality is that this was a grovelling kowtow to a president across the pond who is not in any way committed to NATO and who would walk away from NATO at a moment's notice, and indeed has already demonstrated that he's in bed with Russia, that he is a pro-Putin sympathizer, he cares not a damn for Ukraine, and he will look after his interests and forget about the alliance. So I'm afraid I don't think it met the requirement. There was no recognition at all of the existential threat that Russia's war in Ukraine is posing not only to Ukraine but to Europe as a whole. No recognition of the ongoing covert war against Europe by Russia. No recognition of the need for Europe and the alliance to really step up to the mark to do what needs to be done to achieve peace and security long term in Europe. And it was and then of course the much trumpeted 5% of GDP. By 2035. I mean, I'm sorry, it doesn't stack up.
So my next question was going to be, because of that 5% pledges to be spent on defence and security, is Europe finally stepping up? I guess the answer is no, and certainly not quick enough.
No, it's not. I mean, let's go back to the NATO summit 2014 in Wales, when NATO members agreed to move to 2% of GDP within 10 years. 11 years later, we're not even there yet. There are a number of NATO nations that are not spending 2% of GDP on defence. A number have just scrabbled across the start line, as it were, before this NATO summit, 11 years late. Look at this country. We have, where is the money going to come from? You've got a Labour government that is threatened with a rebellion by Labour backbenchers because of minimalistic welfare reforms, which might have been able to transfer a bit of money into defence. But even that is unlikely. So I'm afraid the 5% within 10 years is cloud cuckoo land. What is needed is 5%. Come on, we've got to hold people's feet to the fire on this.
You mentioned all the things that were not in the final communique, which you believe should have been. Obviously, presumably they were not there because the whole intention was to keep Trump engaged from walking away from the summit and to actually keep him on board with NATO. If that was the necessary evil, perhaps it was worth it.
I would love it if we could say after the summit that we have total confidence that if a NATO member was attacked, Trump would come to the aid of it under Article 5. We cannot have that confidence. Yeah, he was there in person-ish, but the reality is you look at the way that Trump's America has effectively destroyed the international rules-based order. Trump's America has voted alongside Russia and Belarus against the European Union in the United Nations against a motion condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine. Trump's America stated categorically at the Munich Security Conference under Hegseth, the defense secretary, that America is not going to underwrite European security. How can we rely on America to underwrite NATO's Article 5 and the doctrine of collective defense?
Well, and yet the statement from the summit, it did say right at the top, it reaffirmed the alliance's ironclad commitment to collective defence enshrined in Article 5. I mean, you could say, for now, it's drawn a line under that hesitancy that Donald Trump actually expressed on his way over to the summit. Or do you actually think those words have done lasting damage and further encourage your adversaries to put it to the test?
That statement of the ironclad commitment to Article 5 and collective defense is only worth anything if the means and the will is there. Europe has not and it seems to be still faffing around, incapable of generating the means. And America has demonstrated, again, through its actions and its words, that is a hollow statement. And if I were Putin, I would be sitting there thinking, firstly, I think I would be thinking that Rutte's display of fawning, cringing to Trump demonstrates not strength, but total weakness. I would be thinking that I've got NATO where I want it because America is effectively decoupled from European security, and that Trump has gone some way to undermining NATO by his words and his actions. And I would be thinking I might just have a go at one stage when I'm ready at maybe one of the NATO countries in the Baltic states, for example. Because what would change my mind is if I had seen strong words from NATO leaders stating, America, either you're in or you're out. Meanwhile, we are going to double down and do what is absolutely necessary, make the sacrifices necessary to shore up our defenses alone and assume we cannot rely on you, to Europeanize NATO. We've had nothing of that. What we've had is this desperate attempt to paper over the cracks, to try and keep Trump on side, to produce a minimalist communique, a NATO summit light, because the attention span of Trump is so minimalist that he can't cope with anything rigorous and serious. And it just demonstrates weakness, not strength.
What would you be doing and saying now if you were still in post as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe?
Well, if I was still in post, I would be doing what the NATO political leadership directed me to do as a soldier. And similarly, if I was in a UK position, I would be doing what the British government would be doing, recommending. But as a senior soldier, the role of a senior soldier is to lay out the military implications of policy so that democratically elected political leaders can make the political decision. And as you could probably tell from my tone, I would be pretty uncompromising in my advice about the need to strengthen NATO, about the reality of Russia's threat, about the imperative of bringing Russia to the conference table, the peace conference table. And the only way that is going to happen, it's not going to happen. The only way there will be a lasting peace in Ukraine is when Russia accepts President Zelensky as the democratically elected president, recognizes the Ukrainian constitution and Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign state. And that is only going to happen with the defeat of Russia. And that is only going to happen when Europe and America get their act together and support Ukraine to achieve that.
And on the reality of the threat posed by Putin's Russia, President Zelensky is convinced that he will try and put Article 5 to the test within 5 years. Where and when would this be, do you think?
Well, I think President Zelensky is absolutely right to say that. And that risk has increased as a result of the craven weakness shown by Rutte, the Secretary General, and NATO European leaders by failing to step up to the mark in this summit. Where and when? I think the clue is in the way the Russians have been operating. The regular Zapad, or so-called the Zapad exercises every 4 years or so that Russia was practicing in and around the Baltic region, where a regular scenario was an attack on and the takeover of one or more of the Baltic states. The fact is that here is the man who said that the most appropriate security settlement for Europe is a new Yalta. Putin has his eyes on the old Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe. And don't forget, of course, he's also got his eyes on those 3 NATO countries that were once Soviet states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Just to take the opposing view of Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, you could argue that rather than being embarrassingly fawning, that his handling of Trump was deft, and that actually he is living up to that sort of fabled title as the Trump whisperer, and that also he did make stronger statements that weren't in the final communique. For example, that NATO is facing an existential threat, that it's posed by Russia, that Russia is preparing for a protracted war with the alliance, and that it will be ready within 3 to 7 years. So, and that it is more prepared than NATO. So those things were said.
They were said. 2 points. I think the first point I'd make is that there's a real mismatch between the war in 3 to 7 years from Russia and the reality of trying to get across the line of 5% of GDP on defense within 10 years. So what are we going to say? If Russia's going to attack within 3 to 7 years, well, surely we should be doubling down on defense spending now to meet that threat. I think the second point I'd make is the nature of handling Trump. I think my reading would be that where Trump is a bully. Where Trump meets fawning weakness, he likes to double down on humiliation. Where he meets sharp elbows and strength, he backs off. I would highlight, I think, Prime Minister Carney in Canada, who didn't show fawning, creeping submission. He demonstrated strength. And funny old thing, we've heard much less from Trump about taking over Canada as a 51st state since then. So I think, there's a message there.
And President Zelensky, on his recent trip to London, has been trying to push the message of the threat posed by Russia and really drive it home. And he talked about Russia in an interview preparing for the mass production of Orezhnik missiles. Do you think this is true and he is right? And if that is true, how dangerous is that development?
Well, I mean, I'm sure President Zelensky's got much better intelligence than I have. So I think I take that as read, that is correct. He's not crying wolf, and it is very dangerous. And the so what is faced by a threat, faced by the potential threat from Russia. Russia only understands one thing, which is strength. And that means that it comes right back to where we started, about delaying spending what needs to be spent on defense for 10 years. That will be construed as weakness by Putin, and he will absolutely double down on the production of Orezhnik missiles and building up other capabilities. Whereas if he is met by strength, he will back off.
And strength through sanctions as well, because he also provided a list of the Russian overseas companies evading sanctions, manufacturing dual-use components for these missiles, which he said are made available via states neighbouring Russia. I mean, in terms of NATO's attitude towards sanctions, is there enough urgency to actually dig into the detail of how the Kremlin is really evading them?
There isn't enough urgency. And again, I heard that interview, and he talked about some British companies providing dual-use capabilities. I'm sure they don't deliberately set out to do so. But absolutely, sanctions need to address that. Another example, the European Union has paid Russia 3 times for oil and hydrocarbons since the war started, in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They've paid Russia 3 times what they've paid in terms of military support to Ukraine. So the European Union is underwriting Russia's defense effort. And so secondary sanctions on those who import oil and other hydrocarbons from Russia should be absolutely applied. And this brings us back to the real issue here, which is there is a crying need for some proper strategic thinking, which says that works out and agrees the goal of Europe whole, free and secure against Russia, which will continue to pose an existential threat. The way you achieve that is through defeating Russia in Ukraine. And that means a line of operation that says that the Europe and the West gives whatever support Ukraine needs in terms of military capability, training support, other advice. But there are also financial and economic lines of operation. Financial to hit Russian banks, and economic to hit the Russian economy. And that includes sanctions and also means oil price measures. This needs to be thought of strategically, and there is I can't see any indication of real strategic thinking.
How much damage is being done by the prolonged and protracted talks about having talks to end, to bring about a ceasefire? Because we've had it only just like yesterday from Donald Trump saying, "Oh, I'm going to talk to President Putin again." How much damage is that doing to actually European allies of Ukraine coming up with their strategic thinking, their strategic plan?
Again, what it does is just play Putin's game, and Putin is playing Trump, because Trump is. There will not be peace in Ukraine, as I said earlier, until Putin recognizes Ukraine as a sovereign state and the Ukrainian constitution. And that's never going to happen unless Putin is brought up, absolutely stopped short in Ukraine, and recognizes that he will never achieve success there. I think my own view is that that's never going to happen while Putin is in power. And that's the challenge that we face in the West.
Zelensky, he's also claiming that the war in Ukraine is actually serving a purpose in so much as it's slowing President Putin's efforts to build Russia's capabilities. It's wiping out its personnel on the battlefield, and that in 10 years' time, there's going to be a completely different story, and he'll have another army ready. Do you think that message is getting through to NATO?
I don't think it is. If it was, we would have seen a resounding declaration of the threat Russia poses and the need to support Ukraine, defeat Russia in Ukraine in this recent NATO summit.
So you genuinely think then, despite Donald Trump's positive experience of the NATO summit for himself, that it hasn't opened up any new window of opportunity or persuaded him to refocus on Ukraine, irrespective of the fact that there was this kind of moving moment where a reporter, wife of a Ukrainian soldier, talked at a press conference to Donald Trump and basically got him to say that he would consider selling more Patriot missiles to Ukraine. Is that just like one of those things that he says and is not taken seriously? Or do you think perhaps the personal touch does get through sometimes?
Well, let's see if anything happens. Let's see what military aid Trump's America now starts doubling down on to give Ukraine. You might forgive me for being a bit cynical on this one, but I don't think it's going to happen.
Can we just briefly talk about the Senate confirmation hearing of his nominee for Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Lieutenant General Alexis G. Grinkovich? He said at that confirmation hearing, "I think Ukraine can win." I suppose, yes, it can if it's given what it's needed to win. But when you assess the current battlefield situation, isn't it a question of who is actually just losing the slowest?
Saka designate is absolutely right. Ukraine can win, and that's a hopeful sign from the other side of the pond. Firstly, it's very, very good news that America has appointed a new Saka to replace the current incumbent. Yes, Ukraine can win, and it needs the sort of strategic thinking that I've been talking about. So that is also good news. Is Ukraine losing? No, it's not. But is it winning? No, it's not. Equally, Russia is not winning, but it's not losing. And the key thing here is to continue to keep Ukraine in the fight. And Ukraine has demonstrated in abundance its maneuver, its agility, its ability to really, really hit hard at Russia with, I mean, the good example was the spider's web attack on the strategic bomber fleet of a few weeks back. I've absolutely no doubt that there's more of that in the pipeline. And all it's got, this is not going to take what it is going to take is more of that tied to the sort of thing we saw in Kursk last year from Ukraine, tied to making Crimea impossible for the Russians to hold on to. And this again brings us back to what Europe and Canada need to be doing to support Ukraine.
What are the chances, do you think, that Putin's Russia will be a greater threat to NATO when the war with Ukraine is actually over than it is now?
It depends on the conditions the war ends in. If it is defeat of Russia, I mean, the first point is that we have to assume that Russia will never give up its intent to remove Ukraine from the map as a sovereign state. So even if there is recognition in Russia that they have to come to the table and agree a peace deal, assume Russia will attack at some stage in the future. And that means a deal has got to be imposed on Russia that says Ukraine's joining NATO. NATO is going to back Ukraine to the hilt, and if necessary, put planes in the skies above, if necessary, troops on the ground. Actually, Ukraine doesn't need any of that because they've got plenty on their own. But do all the things that would make Ukraine secure as a NATO ally and to reinforce that the importance of collective defense. And that means NATO has got to look to a future of continuing to deter against a Russia that is always going to be on the lookout to repeat what it's tried to do in Ukraine.
General Sir Richard Shirreff, great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.